Okay. Uh, I probably won't take nearly all of the time because I don't have that much material. There's not that much to say about this operating system, but I wanted to speak with you a little bit about. We've gone directly from containers, which is the hip thing of 2015 and 2016, to AIX, which is an operating system that I believe was first released in 1987. Um, and just talking a little bit about some of you who actually here is running AIX machines. Okay, Sean, really? I guess we are. I guess we are. We have some power machines in the closet or in the data center. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool. Why we decided to do this? Some interesting technical challenges coming to it as a product person. I actually was working on this as an engineering manager, and I knew virtually nothing about this platform before I first started working on it. So just some interesting technical challenges that we had to overcome while we were doing this. Quirky things about the platform that are interesting. Some of them are interesting. Some of them are more interesting than others. Some of them are just painful. Some community developments. There are lots of folks that are using AIX out there, still running a lot of workloads on that still work fine. So people are contributing to the code base and community cookbooks and things like that. Talk a little bit about test kitchen support, which is not something that we have talked about previously, but we have written some plugins and things like that for test kitchen that are like super rough. They're not released yet, but I'd be interested in knowing if you're using test kitchen and would be interested in having the source code for that. And then just pointers to some resources and questions about this platform. So, one of the major motivations behind this client port to AIX is I think we started looking at doing this when I first started at Chef, which was over 3 years ago. And just a lot of customers are, like I said, they're running a lot of, I guess you might call them legacy deployments. There's few new deployments of AIX today, but it's not uncommon that if you invested in this platform heavily from the 80s onward, that you have a large deployment that is like thousands of LPARs. That's not uncommon. And, by the time we got to maybe like 15, 20 serious customers that were asking us if we supported this because they basically wanted to run their AIX environment the same as their Linux environment, we started looking seriously at what it would take to do this. The way that AIX sysadmins traditionally have managed AIX is using either by typing shell script commands directly into the terminal or using this tool. This is SMIT. It's a menu-driven. It's kind of like an ncurses based interface. This is a text version. There's a GUI version too, which I guess is it's like a mosaic front end type of thing, right? So you can click around and do stuff. The problem is that it's a menu-driven operation, and most people never actually got beyond this when they were administering systems. And actually, if you press in this, I think if you press one of the function keys, it actually can spit out the command that it's going to do when you select all the menu items. But most people have not yet. If you hit F6, most people don't do that, and so they have actually a lot of AIX admins are more of the, if you will, the operator type that don't know shell scripting, that have basically grown up their entire lives administering these systems through a menu. So there's a couple of use cases for that. These businesses are trying to move workloads, sometimes like moving a WebLogic like for like from a AIX platform to a Linux platform. But as an on-ramp to retrain the talent, instead of being like, first you need to go learn Linux, and then you need to go learn Chef and all this stuff. Some customers found it easier just to teach people Chef and teach folks a declarative DSL and manage the existing workloads on AIX with that. And then once you move over to Linux, then it's sort of like an up and over kind of strategy, right? First you learn the DSL, you know how to generally deploy WebLogic through this declarative interface, and then over time you would learn how to manage a Linux machine. And of course, when you do menu-driven operations like this, it's you get drift and people just making manual changes and all the things that we know that are just generally bad about doing things manually as a one-off. So some of the technical challenges that we found with porting to this platform is we just generally had a pretty low or no familiarity with the platform, the hardware, architecture, setup, and all this stuff. So I don't go into I don't go into it in this presentation, but you're not only just buying the operating system when you buy AIX, as you probably know if you administer it, right? You're buying a whole power architecture, and you're buying a out-of-band management system that's called an HMC, and that's how you actually talk to the actual hardware, and all the virtualization is actually in hardware, so it's actually enforced in the, well, I guess it's the BIOS or whatever of the power servers, and so you use the HMC, the management console, to enforce hardware partitioning and things like this, right? Where literally the chip and the circuitry on the server is enforcing things like CPU utilization and memory and things like that. So it is a hypervisor-based system, but it's all in hardware. There's I guess there's sort of a GNU. People have tried to port GNU software to AIX, and there's like freeware sites and things like that out there. But canonically, the way that so one of the benefits, I guess, of this platform, and the reason why there's still a lot of companies using it, is if you compile everything with their proprietary compiler, XLC, then that binary is guaranteed to basically be forwards compatible for the rest of time, right? So literally, if you would compile things with XLC in like 1989, like literally you could still run them like for like on a modern system, right? And so that's why we decided to, in addition to some other procedural complications with just GNU tools aren't really tested that well in this platform, so we just ran into a lot of issues with like core dumping and things like that. We decided that we would use XLC to build Ruby and the whole Chef client, so that basically the binaries that we give to customers will just run forever. So there's no GNU-isms, right? So you have to basically bootstrap an entire. You don't have, first of all, you don't bash or anything like that, right? It's Corn shell. You don't have a lot of the tools that you're used to, like even less. Like you don't have that kind of stuff, right? You bootstrap the entire system and everything you need kind of from scratch, because they don't have any of the tooling that you're often used to now today. When I said there's no real package manager, what they have is the original file format is BFF, which is effectively I guess you could think of it as like almost like a CPIO archive that you just like unpack the thing onto the file system and away you go, right? And they do have RPM, which they acquired in a later version, but it's just RPM. It doesn't do dependency management. There's no yum or anything like that, right? So you have to resolve all the deps by hand, and it's kind of a pain in the ass, right? They have two init systems with it. So there's a traditional BSD sys5 style init system on AIX. And then sometime, I guess, in the 90s, they started to do this thing, which is called SRC, Service Resource Controller, which is kind of like an SMF or a systemd type of framework. But it's almost like they never finished it, because there's like key features that are missing in it, which I'll get to in a little bit. But it's kind of like a process supervisor, like a run it type of thing. But it feels like they just never finished the job, so now you have two. The virtualization features are sometimes kind of cool. So like, it's funny, Sean just finished talking about containers and Docker and things like this. And a lot of these things about like per process containerization and partitions and things like this actually came from IBM. It's just the difference is, so you have like workload partitions, which are basically process partitions. But the difference is it's not like an artifact that you can move around, but you can exploit these things, and I'll show you a little bit of that a little bit later. But you can exploit some of these virtualization features, which are kind of containery today, right? But this stuff existed, like literally that stuff exists in AIX, and it existed all the way back to like System 360, like on the mainframe. So everything old is new again, kind of. Okay, so just some weird quirks and specific features about this platform that are of interest. So if you run Chef Client on AIX, which is free, by the way, I know sometimes our competitors charge for the client based on the platform you're running, like we don't. So you can get the client and use it for free against the Chef server. All the features that you would expect, every resource that you would expect works out of the box in AIX and has its own provider that does the useful work. There's special resources in core, so the package provider is going to call BFF package. And then for the service provider, because there's not a good way of it being able to detect like what you want, whether you want the sys5 init system or whether or not you want SRC, like you've got to specify which one you want actually in the when you write the service declaration. And some actions don't work. Like, oh, here's the thing. I wrote this down in the notes. Like SRC, for some reason, doesn't have enable or disable of services. So then you need to write like your own like start enable command as part of the declaration of the resource in your recipe. I wrote, when we were first launching this, I wrote a cookbook. That's a library cookbook. It's called AIX. It's on Supermarket. And you can do things in there I wrote a few providers, and then the community filled in a whole bunch of other ones that are pretty useful, and doing a lot of stuff that, like, I'm not really an AIX admin, right? But there's like lots of tasks people are doing with it, and they wrote a bunch of extra providers in there. So now it has the ability. You can again look it up in the supermarket, and it has ability to like manage your init tab. You've got other services like inetd kind of services through inetd.conf and rctcpip and changing your network attributes and device attributes and managing your file systems and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot more stuff that people have added to this. So like I said, community developments, folks have contributed a lot of resources to this cookbook. When we first wrote this, I was pretty naive about how we did OHI data detection. We didn't really have a lot of feature parity because we didn't know what people wanted exactly to be detecting on their LPARs. So everybody know, like, an LPAR is like you don't actually ever, like, when you run an AIX machine, like, you never actually put the OS directly on bare metal and just run that as one node, right? It's like most commonly you have a server and you're running logical partitions that are enforced in hardware. And so it's common to have, tens, like dozens, or, I guess you could even have like hundreds if you had a big enough machine running these logical partitions on an individual, on a physical box. So a bunch of people took the work that we did and just overhauled all the data that they were interested in detecting in OHI. So there's a lot more features in that since last year when it launched. And then there's a community member named Benoit Crow, who's out of France, who has been using Chef to do all kinds of stuff that, I don't even understand, because again, I'm not a AIX or PowerVC admin. These wrote a whole series of blog posts about doing a bunch of operations, like how to patch entire fleets of AIX machines with Chef and all this stuff. I'll point you to the link at the end of the presentation.
Do you have another reference?
Yeah, I have the link at the end of the deck.
I know, but not. Do you have another reference?
What do you mean?
I know the Bernard blog, but do you have another reference of Bernard?
No. So what we're doing is he sent me all this material, and then we're going to try to rewrite it and clean it up a little bit to be more task oriented, and then put it on the Learn Chef site as like what are they calling it now, like skills library articles for doing those kinds of tasks. So he's helping with that. Okay, so knife and test kitchen support. So in order to integrate this build into our build system, into our build pipeline, we need to write a bunch of plugins and things like this so that we could automate the setup of a lot of these machines, these LPARs and WPARs and stuff like that. So none of these are open source right now, mostly because the code is just kind of disgusting and messy. Like, a lot of it has stuff in there like IP addresses and passwords and things like this that are hard coded to the internal Chef network. But if there's interest, we probably won't do more work on this stuff just because there's not a lot of high demand. But if there's people in the community that would be interested in working on it under a Apache license, I'm sure we could work something out with Nathan's team. But what I'll do is I can demonstrate I screen cap, because unfortunately one of the plugins, the kitchen workload partition plugin, runs in I couldn't figure out how to turn off like SSH debug mode, so it like spewed out all the passwords to like standard out on my laptop, so I couldn't demo it for you live. But I captured the output into a TypeScript and I anonymized it. So let me just show that to you. Okay, so have you ever used Cathode? If you're a little nostalgic for old terminals. Whoops. Right? Okay, so it's this program. You can get it on the App Store, by the way. I think you have to pay a few dollars. It's a funny thing. So this is their funny model about Cathode. If you don't pay, then the terminal degrades in quality over time. So like 45 minutes or half an hour in is totally unusable. But they'll like add Gauss to the monitor. Do you know what I mean? Like, how many of you are old enough to like use a CRT? But it'll degrade the video quality like in a cool way until you pay. So I was like, I'll just pay the guy. I mean, that's awesome. It's awesome that he like spent that much time putting in that feature. But okay, so let me show you an example of this is how I is an example cookbook that I actually do use for when I'm setting up systems for testing and stuff like this. So you can see that you can do things like, so in the AIX cookbook, you have things like be able to install packages so you can get like the IBM, what do they call it, the IBM Linux toolbox or something like this, where they have like freeware RPMs and things like that that are compatible with the system. So you can also install a few things that like make life a little bit easier on this platform, like having less and bash. That's kind of useful. Sometimes AIX systems start with a web server for like management purposes running, so I just turn it off. The Chef Client Cookbook, you can run Chef Client. So the Chef Client Cookbook supports AIX. That's why this is commented out, because this was the initial implementation. But you can manage like the init tab run levels and things like this, and what's the process action? Should it run once, or should it be like a daemon? Certain commands, blah blah. Right. Turn off. Often these systems start in pretty insecure states because it was the 90s, right? And you just ran like all kinds of services. They were on by default, so it's a good thing to turn them off. You can remove a lot more stuff, but it's just an example. And making sure that we have like NTPD, so the clock is fine, and turning off telnet and FTP. And then here you have an example at the bottom, which is a thing like, it's pretty bad to like let people log in with root. So I have a thing where it's just like, execute a command, chuser, and then it's not a good idea to do this on a workload partition because you can't open a console from the LPAR, from the host LPAR into the WPAR when you're doing this. So I just don't do it. So here's an example of like using OHI data to do some conditionals, right? So nothing particularly special here. Pretty typical Chef. So as I said, I have this TypeScript. What do I call it? All right, so this is me running this cookbook inside. We have a cluster of AIX machines in our data center in Seattle. So what this plugin does, this kitchen plugin, is it logs in. So you specify. Does this have tabs? No, of course not, because it's a CRT. There's no tabs in the CRT. So with this plugin, you specify that you want to use the WPAR driver, which again is like a per process container. It's like you can run a WPAR in either per process mode, which would be like the Docker style, like entry point is your process, or you can run it in more of a full-blown like machine style VM, which is what I'm doing here. So you specify the WPAR driver, and then you specify the LPAR, the host machine that you're going to log into, and what password, logging in with a user account that can create WPARs. Now the irritating thing about the WPARs, here's where, like I was saying, some of these features are cool, and then some of them are just like, I don't understand why they didn't finish the job. And one major problem with a workload partition is that you have to hard code the IP address, so they can't start up a WPAR with DHCP, which is kind of silly, right? You have to actually pre-allocate an IP address for your workload partition, even though you're going to throw it away after you run this test, right? So you have to reserve one in IP plan or whatever we're doing these days, and like set the password for the workload partition. So what this does is, look at this TypeScript again. What this is doing is logs in, making sure, so generates a random name for the WPAR, removes it if it already exists, because I'm starting this from scratch, right? And then runs an expect command for creating the WPAR and expect some output. I didn't write this, by the way. A guy named Isa wrote it for us. And then basically it just loops until the WPAR is created. So it's just like creating a Solaris zone. It's going to copy a whole bunch of stuff from the host LPAR over. And then once it's done, you're going to be able to log in over like a virtual serial console using clogin from the host LPAR to the WPAR. So it's just looping until SSHD is running in the guest in the WPAR, and then it's going to log in to that. And then what else is it doing here? It's going to do a few things just to make sure there's enough memory to run Chef. Those limits are set pretty low. And then making sure that there's just enough disk space before we actually install Chef. And then once that is done, make sure that the WPAR is working, then you're just bootstrapping as per the normal procedure within Test Kitchen. And some of the other work that we had to do is we had to make this script. This script used to be bash. We had to remove all the bashisms and make it like actually sh, right? Because like sh in the rest of the world is like we assume it's bash. People just start writing bashes in their sh scripts, even though the hash bang has been sh. And so this is a really actual POSIX compatible sh. So you need to be POSIX compatible compliant. So that was kind of a yak shave. Yeah, there's a big comment at the top of this file that's basically like, this is not bash, this is sh. If you don't know what you're doing or you're under 40, like get code get code review from your peers. Yeah. Yeah.
Like every time Chef bootstrap with that string flies across the internet thousands of times.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just stuff like output redirection doesn't work the way that you think it does, and a variable interpolation doesn't work the way that the bash does it, and stuff like that. So just a lot of subtle stuff. But then you're basically like just going through and downloading the stuff with Perl. Actually, well, I think this system has wget on it, fortunately. But if it doesn't have wget, it will try Perl, and Perl is always on an AIX machine for some reason. And I know the Perl incantation by hand to download files from the internet now. And then once it does that, so we distribute this thing as a BFF package. You pass that to install P, and then here it goes like blah blah. It's going to install the file sets. That's per normal. So Chef is installed, 39 seconds, and then creates the validator, and then the rest of this is just sort of pro forma stuff, right? And then at the end of this, you could run some tests. I don't have any verifiers in here, but at the end of this, then it's just going to basically stop the WPAR and then remove it, right? So it's like modern infrastructure testing using an old platform, which I think is pretty cool. Okay. So back to this for a second. All right, so just a little bit of future work that I want to talk about. So if you're still running Power systems, like IBM is really pushing people to run Linux on Power. So you can run like Big Endian or Little Endian Linux on this, Ubuntu or RHEL 7. So it's going to be some ports. We have a couple of alpha builds of this stuff out. If you're interested in this, any of this stuff, you can contact the partner engineering group. JJ works for partner engineering. Not on this project, but there's a couple engineers that work on this. And if you're interested in being part of the early beta, definitely get on this mailing list. And there's some work to port Chef Server to Linux on Power as well, which should be done by the end of Q1. And then sometime in Q2, we'll be porting Chef Client for Linux to System Z. So actually porting this stuff to Linux running on this architecture is a lot less of a yak shave than porting it to PowerPC, or sorry, the AIX architecture, AIX systems that don't have any of the GNU tools and things like that. Okay, so sort of last slide, just the list of resources that we have for this. So that's where the cookbook is on the supermarket. This is Benoit's blog post about, so he gave a talk on automating AIX with Chef at, I believe there's like an IBM engineering summit or something like that in France. And so this was a couple of months ago where he gave this talk, and it's pretty interesting stuff. Most of it's over my head because, again, I don't have to deal with PowerVC patching and all this stuff, but it seems pretty cool. If you are an IBM partner, or if you have a relationship with IBM and you want machines to play with on a short-term basis, you can get them for free actually through the IBM Power Development Program. It's called the PDP. And they'll rent you an LPAR for a couple of days where you can just, it's a full machine. You don't get access to an HMC or anything like that. You can't really create WPARs because they don't give you more than one IP address for the machine, but you can basically use it any other way, so that's kind of cool. And if you actually need to support longer term like legacy applications and things like that, but you don't want to host it in your own data center, like you just want to get rid of your Power hardware and you just want to like move that workload somewhere, there's this company, I haven't used them, but that seems to be like pretty popular. It's called SiteOx, and it'll rent you kit, right? They'll rent you like an LPAR or a full machine or HMC or what have you. So it's not an endorsement. It's just something I've found on the internet. So that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say about AIX. So are there any questions that I can answer?
Did you just void my warranty?
By what?
Using Chef on AIX.
No.
Okay.
We depended a lot on IBM for their help, actually. So if you've ever tried to, I had a whole thing about like all the yaks we had to shave in here, which I totally skipped over. But like, if you ever looked at how to compile Ruby on a non-standard platform, they do some pretty gnarly stuff. It's not autoconf or anything like that. Like they're redefining word sizes in their script and stuff like that. So we like literally needed to get a couple IBM engineers in India to help us with like patches, which you can find in our Omnibus software tree for like how to run this, how to build Ruby on AIX, like just like pointer relocations and things like this that XLC will try to optimize and be helpful for you that are just like not helpful and break Ruby in funny ways. All right.
Well, I don't know if you have more resources.
Oh, no, no, no.
References.
I'm asking if you have other questions for Julian, not for me. I can't help you with anything.
No, you're the partner. Are there more resources of AIX or more AIX references?
This is about it.
Yeah,
This is pretty much.
There's also, I think, Power VM tools, which let you communicate then rather through Knife, so that you can communicate with overall powers of file servers. There's also Power, Knife Power, which is also a Ruby gem, which you can use to create with Knife L powers automatically with the right amount of use your virtual fabric channel adapters and stuff like that. So if you're into automating LPAR creation, then you should really check those two gems out.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right. Thanks.